welcome back to Reclaim You. Today we're talking with Laura about mothers and daughters on the heels of Mother's Day. Feels like a lot has been coming up for folks. And so we thought this would be a good opportunity to chat a little bit about relationships between mothers and daughters and all that that entails. Hey, I'm so curious about your why, your reasons for wanting to chat about this.
I think, as you said, it's been coming up a lot in the wake of Mother's Day or in leading up to Mother's Day, especially around the issue of like our bodies and our relationship with food and our mothers. But I think it's part and parcel of my own journey, of my relationship with my mother and the healing, the work I had to do, the healing. And especially I lost my mother at 32. And it was a sudden loss. So also the grief around that and like not having the mother I hoped I would have had physically, but didn't have her anyway. So it's partially personal.
Mhm.
And because it's been coming up anecdotally, with clients as well.
Yeah, I feel like partially personal because most things in our work are, right?
Yeah,
As humans in the world who go through so much and the work that we do, there's a reason why we're drawn to it.
exactly.
So thank you so much for being willing to share a little bit of your story. Appreciate that. Tell us a little bit about how you see the impact of how we see ourselves in relationship to relationships with mothers and daughters.
I mean, at first, I guess I want to preface this with this is um, not to encompass all types of relationships of mothers and daughters. Like, I have a particular bias as a white middle class woman in America, right? Who lives on the
Mm-hmm.
East Coast, who comes from an Irish Catholic family. So, like, our ethnic backgrounds, our cultural backgrounds, there's differences there. There's differences of folks who never had a mother,
Mm-hmm.
or who lost their mother through various means. And like, I also think about like those who might not identify as a daughter to their mother, whether, you know, they have affirmed their gender as not the one assigned at birth, and that's shifted relationship, or some other thing has happened where that identity has been in some way impacted. So, I just think it's important. I'm speaking to my own experience, the anecdotal experience I've had as a therapist, and I think as well, like the research in the literature is primarily biased in that direction.
Sure.
And so, it's unfortunate, but there are more voices out there, and there are voices that need to be heard. And, we certainly welcome them to add to this conversation. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Having said that, um, when I think about the impacts, the mother-daughter relationship, this is just for those of us who can claim one, if you will. This is such an intimate, connected, it's such a primary relationship in our lives in so many ways. And I think in being that, there is ample room for that relationship to have wonderful positive impacts on both parties, but also for there to be conflict, for there to be some negative aspects of that. And the areas that, come to mind are certainly the area of self-esteem as a woman, and how my mother impacts that, or my relationship with my mother, and vice versa too. I mean, daughters have, let's not say it's all on the mother here. Daughters have an impact on mothers as well. Certainly the body, our relationship with body and food, career, what is our vocational calling? What are we called to do in life? And then also like intimate relationships, how
Mhm.
we choose our partners in life, how we operate in those relationships. And I think that there's a lot of space for reparation of our sort of outlook on this as a society, because so much for so long was blaming our moms,
Mhm.
right? And there is this tendency still, I think, that we blame our moms for all of these issues, when I think there's room for greater understanding and greater healing, even if there's impact, to also understand that the intent of our mothers, by and large, not all mothers, but the intent is one of coming out of a place of love, right?
Mhm.
So that's
Yeah, and
something
what they were
that is
taught and what they
we have
learned
to,
and yeah.
yeah, their history, having compassion and empathy, and also just in general, like in the therapeutic process, like, yeah, we're going to explore some things, that might be really difficult to explore and might bring up feelings of anger or other feelings towards your mother. At the same time, how do we balance that with the fact that you're in relationship with her? Same again could be said about the mother's relationship with daughter. So I might err on the side of daughter just because that's sort of the place
Mhm.
I'm coming from.
Sure.
um, but I want to honor that mothers are also included in this.
Of course. Of course. Yeah. So because so many of the folks that we work with are struggling with their relationship with food and their relationship with their bodies, let's start there if that feels okay. Where do you see that trickle down? I think we can probably go to the place of like a lot of times we learn dieting behaviors from our mothers or self beliefs around our bodies that there's something wrong with our bodies from our mothers. But could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think first and foremost, we all live in the same society. We live in this diet culture society. We've talked about that in previous podcasts. We're impacted by it, and our mothers, as much as we are, currently are impacted by it. But also, whatever diet culture stuff was happening back when they were getting exposed as a young person, they
Mhm.
also are carrying with them. And so, I think that if I think about as a mother, if I'm a mother, my relationship to my own body has a lot of bearing on the development of my daughter's relationship with her body. And how aware am I of what that relationship is? How connected am I to my body? How accepting am I of my body? What messages am I offering to my daughter, to my sons, to my children, to others about bodies? And what am I sort of repeating that maybe doesn't need to be repeated? That maybe
Mm.
it's an invitation for me to look at that. I think about, that sort of like that primary relationship of mother's relationship with her own body, being a place where there can be exploration for a mother in her own way. Right.
Mhm.
And then there's this daughter who for some mothers is coming from our bodies, right? We've carried
Yeah.
her. She's a part of us. For other daughters, not
Mhm.
the case, but there are
Mhm.
the daughters of our hearts, right?
Mhm.
And
Absolutely.
so we still have, impact on them. And I think about what are the messages when work with clients. It's like, well, what messages did you get growing up about your body, or about food? And
Mhm.
so often they talk about their mom's impact on that.
Mhm.
So if their mother was dieting constantly, as we talked about, they often joined her in that, like going
Mhm.
to Weight Watchers meetings or, whatever the fad of the day is, reading the latest diet book, doing the latest exercise. And so this becomes a way for like mothers and daughters. It becomes this place where like they're invited to bond, but it
Right.
becomes this tough place, right? Where there's a judgment being made as well.
Mhm.
And often daughters really carry a lot of woundedness from that, from a young age, being told that their body wasn't good enough.
Right.
And they already have enough of that they're facing, but then to have their mother reiterating that isn't helpful. And so, from a mother's vantage point, like from both vantage points, like, can we walk a mile in the other's shoes, right? Like,
Mhm.
how would I feel if
Mhm.
it was my mother saying it to me? Ooh, like that kind of
Yeah.
changes the perspective. Or why might my mom be saying this and what has her experience been? That as well might change my perspective to allow more space for dialogue,
Mhm.
and to manage conflict. So, I think about things around weight, things around the clothing we wear, the food that we're eating, the exercises we're engaged in, how worthy we believe, like our bodies representing our worth and our
Mm.
value, and like our mother or, the imperfections of our bodies being pointed out in a way that devalues that.
Yeah.
And also around sexuality as well, which is a whole nother realm, right? But
Oh,
like,
yeah.
a daughter becomes a woman, and sexuality is a part of that.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so what are those messages and conversations? Have there been
Yeah.
any? There are some where
Mhm.
that doesn't happen at all.
I'm even thinking of the loss that so many people experience when validation of their body disappears because of body change and how that does feel like a huge loss of connection in the relationship that they're not being seen anymore because their body is different or the meaning of that may be their body is now bad or not good enough or
Yeah.
anything like that, and how impactful that can be when it comes to the relationship with mothers and daughters.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes the topic of conversation. It become, like our mothers assume that place in our lives as someone who with whom we can talk about this at times, and that's true. But when the discussion becomes more about pointing out faults or trying to change a daughter and her body, that's where it's problematic. And I also want to honor that, like, the impact being negative, but the intent, mothers are living vicariously sometimes to their daughters, or their own lived experience is impacting that.
Mhm.
So I know what it was like to live in a larger body, and I don't want my daughter to have to suffer.
Mhm.
So I'm going to
Yeah.
do anything it takes so that she doesn't have to suffer. And we
Mhm.
often then align with diet culture stuff, right?
Right.
Thinness,
Right.
diets, exercise, versus I know what it was like to not be able to accept my body in a diet culture.
Mm.
How can I help my daughter to accept hers?
Yes. Yes.
It might be completely countercultural, but
Definitely
this is the place.
countercultural. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the place where we can begin in the home, and encouraging an acceptance, a celebration of body, whatever body you're in. And
Mhm.
also that our bodies change, and a mother who has lived longer and walked through life longer knows how much our bodies change as women over a lifetime, and that change in the body can, as you said, bring up all of these conflicts in ourselves and in our relationships, but it can also be a point of celebration. And I think about, like, cultures where, that time in a woman's life where she's changing, whether it's puberty or in birth, we're so steeped in ritual and, like, this celebration of womanhood, this celebration of childbirth and child rearing, and this wise council of women surrounding women
Mm.
in that, right?
Mhm.
Because we put so much emphasis on, like, mom has to get all her shit together and get it
Right.
right.
Mhm.
No mother is going to be able to do that, right? Like, and so I also
Yeah.
think about, like, we need other mother figures, and how do we create that for our daughters and for
Mhm.
ourselves as adults? I don't, my mother is no longer living, but I have a lot of maternal figures in my life who
Mhm.
provide wisdom in different ways. Whether it's an aunt, or, a grandmother, or, mom's best friend, or some other someone. And yeah, so I think it's important. How do we create a space of a network of wisdom and safety for each other?
Mhm.
And me as a mother, that I can go to other women and have that wisdom, and learn and grow. Me as a daughter, that I have that network as well, so that there's not so much pressure
Mhm.
on this relationship all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, to be everything
Hmm.
and anything all at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm. I think that in our work, so many folks start to realize maybe what was missing in their relationship with their moms, what maybe they wish were different, maybe how they want to mother in the world, whether to their own children or to, you know, friends, other family members, things like that, how they want to mother differently. I
Hmm.
think a lot of times there starts to become this inner conflict of like, how do I renegotiate my own relationship with my mother as I'm realizing this and working towards wanting to mother differently or show up differently in my life? I'm curious if you have
Hmm.
any thoughts on how to kind of manage some of that conflict, whether that's internal conflict about the relationship with their mother or the external conflict of, you know, trying to set boundaries, maybe not wanting to set boundaries because sometimes the boundary setting can be so scary because, like, what if she leaves? Like, what if she's gone? You know, what if she doesn't accept my boundary?
Yeah.
How to start to negotiate some of that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think first and foremost is to remember that conflict can be helpful, because it invites us to have to think about these things and work through them. So if there's conflict in the relationship, or if conflict is lurking in some way, to not be afraid of that per se. It might be uncomfortable, but this, to look at it as perhaps this is an opportunity for growth in all parties. But yeah, I think that there is this need to create space in a relationship, in any relationship, but particularly the mother daughter relationship, where is the space for each to be their own person? So that me as a mother,
Mhm.
I want what's best for my daughter. At the same time, I'm honoring that she is her own person and has her own needs and her own space in which she operates, and vice versa. I'm a daughter, and I look at my mother and say, wow, mom is dealing with her own stuff here, and mom has her own space in which she operates and her own perspective on this. So to really, again, like, be able to put yourself in the shoes of the other at times. And now, I say that as a 45-year-old woman, right? If we're talking about
Mhm.
15-year-old, different story per
Right.
se.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, like, I guess first and foremost, like, as well, like, is that idea of, what are the expectations that are lurking in the background that are impacting us? So, like, there are so many unspoken expectations in relationships. So what were the expectations that we think our mother has of us, that we're
Mhm.
carrying with us, that might be creating some of that conflict? Like, oh my gosh, I should have children, or I shouldn't have children, or I should be a stay-at-home mom, or I shouldn't be a stay-at-home mom, or whatever. I mean, the
Mhm.
list is endless. But to think about, like, what are those expectations, and what is truly an expectation, that might need to be worked out with mom, or what is something that I've interpreted as one but is not, right?
Mhm.
Like if I really talk to mom about it, she's like, oh, wait a minute, like, that was my experience, but, like, I recognize that your experience is different. But sometimes
Mhm.
we assume things. And I think it's important that those, that expectations in general, there's flexibility around them, and there is this ability, again, to honor that each of us is an individual who is living in our own space as much as we're connected to one another and want the best for one another.
What about boundaries? How it feels really hard. I know personally, and for the folks that we work with and friends, and really boundaries are just hard, right? Therapists, we talk about boundaries a lot, but boundaries are hard. So let's talk about that a little bit. Setting boundaries with folks who are our mothers and daughters and in that relationship,
Mhm.
and what that looks like,
Mhm.
and maybe why it's so hard, because gosh, it's hard.
Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, there's, like, there's so much ingrained in the relationship. There are so many patterns and habits laid down in a relationship that when a woman is coming into her own and starting to realize her own desires, wishes, hopes for herself, and recognize where that is not aligned maybe with mom, or recognizing, like, ooh, I used to believe that thing mom would talk about, but I don't want to believe that anymore. That's not really who I am or who I want to be. And it is difficult because, especially women that I work with, they want to continue to have a relationship with their mother, right? And yet, in setting boundaries, know that inevitably that could cause conflict.
Yeah.
And again, as you said, there's that fear, like, what does that mean for the future of our relationship? And
Hmm.
I think, the invitation that I offer is coming back to the self first, and really sort of working with yourself, whether you're a mother or a daughter, to sort of identify the areas that are problematic, challenging, to identify your own expectations or hopes and wishes for yourself, so that you're pretty clear, you're clear about that, because it can get
Hmm.
muddy when mom's involved, or when, mom and daughter are involved. And, I say to folks, like, whether that's like you're sitting down with trusted others, you're doing this work in therapy, but, there is this aspect, as you put it, of the sort of like the internal process of mothering ourselves.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that can take place at the same time that we have a mother who is with us, and not in a she's not good enough way, but in a
Hmm.
she's, you know we're only capable of so much as human beings, and when I'm a
Hmm.
mother, I'm going to have the same, struggles, perhaps in different ways, but I'm not going to be able to be all things to my daughter.
Right.
And so I think it's part and parcel of, like, being willing to step into that space and start to do the work internally myself, but then also honoring that as my daughter is doing that work, maybe I'm invited to do some of my own work
Mm.
internally as a mother,
Yeah.
and from my perspective. I often hear from folks, like, they've struggled for years and they're like, I just wish my mom would change. I just wish she would change, and she doesn't hear me, and she won't blah blah blah. And, like, we have to come to a place of, like, you cannot change the other person. Like, that's not,
Yeah.
if that's where we lay our the bulk of our energy, it's futile, because a person
Hmm.
needs to decide in and of themselves if they want to change, if they want to shift how they see the world, how they are in the world, how they are in relationship with us. And so for years, I think there is this like conflict of like trying to change, like, see it my way. Why can't you see it my way? Why can't you do it my way, from both parties? And what would it be to give space for both to sort of on their own look at what is important to me, and ultimately what is the biggest priority? If the priority is that I want a relationship with my daughter or with my mother that is, I don't know, whatever it is. I mean, you choose the word, right? But that this is the type of relationship that I want with my mother. For some of us, that might be very boundaried,
Mhm.
because mom has her own issues and she can't change, and she's, mom might have, there's borderline mothers out there. There's mothers who are struggling with addictions. There's mothers who are abusive in other ways. Like, so like that boundary is going to change and shift accordingly. And at the same time, recognizing when a boundary might be set that was for safety and protection at a point, but is no longer needed and no longer necessary, right? Like, so it can
Mhm.
be a both and. But I think it's
Yeah.
hard to do that on your own. I think you need help, right?
Mhm.
Like, to have an
Mhm.
objective party to start to talk to and just sort of sort through those feelings and things that have been trapped and that you haven't been able to voice for so many years. And then to
Yeah.
slowly step into exposing yourself to creating boundaries, right? So,
Mm.
like, what is most irksome right now, or what is most impacting me right now, and what boundary might be needed, and how do I try that, right?
Mhm.
And how do I try it in a way that is compassionate toward mom or daughter versus blaming them?
Mm. Yeah.
Mm.
I'm thinking too of
If it,
the support that's needed to even like increase the number of boundaries that people are putting in place to be really more
yeah,
self-protective. It does feel like you were mentioning that internal mothering process of to feel really safe and protected from maybe certain aspects of the relationship or this other person, the mother or the daughter, maybe adding more boundaries and having support in negotiating, like what does that look like? Does that look at like the gauntlet is down and full cut off, or does that look like you can really only come to my house at these certain times of day, or when you do, I want you to
yeah,
knock, or whatever it is, like those are just kind of basic ones. But how helpful it can be to have someone to process that with, and to acknowledge what your internal response is to that, and the whys behind that, and how you can care for yourself through it, that internal mothering process.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, for sure. To have that other party involved in the process is, I think, just been so helpful to me, to others that I
Mm,
know. And, my clients will say that as well, because this becomes a safe space where they can explore things that they just cannot go to those places with their mom for whatever reason, out of fear,
mhm,
out of their past lived experience with mom. And there's also that sense of support and accountability as well. Like, okay, so like I want to set this boundary, but why do I keep not setting it? So let's
mhm.
talk about that. What is the
Yeah.
stuck point? What's coming up? And it's really hard to balance processing all the emotions, and there's negative emotions. There's anger. For some women it's rage, right? Like it's
Yeah.
it's it's anger on a whole nother level. Disappointment, sadness, loss, grief. There's so much. How do we process those emotions safely so that they're not interfering with our desires for a relationship with each other?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Right? I've processed my anger and I found a way to talk to my mom or my daughter about that anger, but without all of the heightened emotion, and instead with the ability for both of us to come together and really hear and listen, or for at least me to stand my ground and be able to say words that can be heard.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then on the other side of this comes when there's so much grief around like things not going the way you want them to, right? Like the boundaries not
Uh-huh.
being held or honored or respected, or not being seen or acknowledged, validated, affirmed in all of the ways that you're wanting your mom or your daughter, to do that for you. And being with that, and it feels just like very intense grief of losing even sometimes the
Yes.
hope that that's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is such a well-made point. I think about the idea of grief and acceptance. There is a process of grief because no one relationship can ever be all the things we wish it would be. And so inevitably there are things that we might grieve. And in a mother-daughter relationship, there are all of these tropes out there about what it should look like or what it, will look like. And yet the lived experiences are very different. And so I might have had this social trope about what a relationship with a mother daughter looks like that's been with me as a mother. And I want that with my daughter. And I'm trying so hard to make it happen. But in trying so hard to make it happen, I'm pushing her away. Right.
Yeah.
And I, as a daughter, so badly want something else. Right. Like I just wish my mom would hear me, or I just
Mm,
wish my mom would accept me, even though it's different from what she desired or wanted. And yet, anytime I try to give voice to that, she shuts me down. And again, we're pushing the relationship away. So, how do
yeah.
we learn to accept each other? Like, sometimes I think it's really about coming together and maybe with the help of a third party, a therapist, to start to look at, like, who are we? How do I know my daughter or my mother as I was at this age or at this stage of
Mm,
life, but like that's not the stage we're in now.
right.
So in every
Yeah.
stage, how do I acquaint myself with this person and make space for them to grow? That, like, as much as your daughter, obviously there's a growth that's going to happen, and we know that mom's growing too. Mom's growing and learning and struggling just as we are. And so the acceptance that neither of us is going to be perfect in that equation, but that both of us can together, through our individual means of doing our work and perhaps in a collective means of coming together, really start to honor and embrace who we are, forgive, perhaps, like give voice to the things like, this really hurt me, mom. My mom
Mm-hmm.
worked and went to school. And there is a very vivid memory I carry with me. I was maybe 8, and mom had, I might have been younger than that. And my mother would be home during the day sleeping. Then she would go to school as soon as I got off the bus. And then she would go to work overnight. And then she'd come home in the morning. And as I was getting on the bus, she was coming home. So I would run after her car when she was
Mm.
leaving to go to school. So I'd get home, get off the bus. She'd get in her car to leave, say goodbye. And I would run crying after it. My father would
Oh,
have to
yeah.
come and, like, you know, console me, because mommy wasn't there and I didn't understand. And I internalized that in a lot of ways, that like I felt abandoned by her. She also lost her father very traumatically when I was shy of 2 years of age. And I know that impacted us, in a lot of ways, because my father even said like she wasn't able to be a mother in such a pertinent time. And she was pregnant with my brother as well. So, like, the circumstances of life have an impact on us. And how do we explain the impact without putting all the blame on the other person? Like, how do we do so in a way that is empathetic, that is able to have compassion? And
Mm.
then how do I receive this information with a sense of detachment, if it will, with a sense of
Hmm.
like being there to hear it and to really listen deeply versus defend myself?
Yeah.
Because I think we're
Yeah.
so often on the defensive.
Yeah, it feels like that. I'll say basic concept that maybe isn't so basic because it's hard and nuanced. It's that, like, the rupture and the repair, and the rupture and the repair that we know is what builds really strong and healthy relationships and strong attachment too. So being able to engage in that, like,
Yeah.
across the lifespan, whether you're like a little person who doesn't really know and you're a mom to a little person who doesn't really know, I can relate to that. To be able to come back to the basics of, like, when there's a rupture, when there's a fracture, the most important thing that you can do is attune and repair, always.
Yeah. And that's the hardest thing to do with the people we're closest to,
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
in a way it is a safe place and there's all these patterns. So like I know that if I scream and holler at my mother, that we can act out more with our families of origin, and in doing so there's a lot more hurt that can be done because we say
Hmm.
things that maybe in the company of strangers or acquaintances we would reframe or
Hmm.
rephrase. And that does take some ability to sort of step back and consider the other. That is a practice. And so to imagine that as a practice and an opportunity,
Hmm.
and to how do we befriend each other at various stages and
Mhm.
honor those stages, and maybe we create our own rituals as mother and
Mhm.
daughter. Like how do we, I think about moms and daughters. My mother and I, she would take me to there was this tea room in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, and students from Curtis Institute of Music would play at it. And so she, would take me to high tea there once a year. And that would be like a mother
Mm.
daughter thing that we did. And it was really special because, like, when we went, I don't know, it was like this part of me, this experience was so important to me that whatever might have been lurking in the background, I was able to sort of set aside so that the
Mhm.
experience was what it was. It's not always
Mhm.
the case, but,
Right.
you know, maybe that ritual once a year that we do with our daughters also involves a conversation about like
Mm.
our relationship or our desires or our hopes, or what are the areas that we want to grow and learn in together, and there's intentionality there. So often, like, we're going through the motions because we're busy, and that's totally understandable, but can we carve out space for intentionality with one another
Mhm. Absolutely.
to really connect on that deeply?
Yeah. Are there any other thoughts you have on healing and forgiveness and what that looks like? You just mentioned a couple, which feel really important.
Yeah, the one thought that keeps coming to me, and this is my own lived experience, is that
Mhm.
forgiveness and healing are not bound by the constructs of like time and space, if you will, not to get too woo woo about it, but
Mhm.
a
I
lot of
love the
my
woo.
healing with my
Bring it
relationship,
on.
yeah, a lot of my relationship healing with my mother, the vast majority of it took place after she died.
Mhm.
And she wasn't here physically for me to pursue that. So I had to find, different ways, but also my own understanding of life after death, my own spirituality played a role in that. And we each have our own set of beliefs around that. But just, like, I do believe that for most situations, if if there's hope, if there's a desire by both parties to heal, that healing can be possible, but it might take a lot of work. And that, even when we have those missteps and or huge blowouts, how do we come back to what is the greatest, deepest desire of my heart in this relationship? And how do I continue to step in that direction? Healing also sometimes is about not being in relationship with.
Mhm. Yeah.
There are some mothers and or daughters who we cannot be in relationship with for a variety of reasons. And each person has their own journey around what that is. And that's fraught with its own guilt and shame.
Mhm.
So, you know, the reality is that it's not always going to be a happy ending.
Yeah.
And yet, even in not being a happy ending, how can we forgive the person who is our mother or our daughter as they are, understanding that they've been impacted by other aspects of life, right?
Mhm.
Like that the
Mhm.
intent has always been to love potentially. The impact may have not been that way. So, like, can from a
Mhm.
distance I forgive and accept as they are. And quite
Mhm.
frankly, if I haven't done the work of acceptance and forgiveness of me, how the heck can I do that with anyone else?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I need to look at myself, like, where are the places that I'm stuck? Where are the places that I'm really, and perhaps I'm projecting that onto this other person, my mother, my daughter, and I need to again double back and look at myself. So, I
Mhm.
think there's like myriad ways
Mhm.
to do this. I think at the heart of it, it's coming back to knowing and accepting and loving and forgiving oneself, and then expanding that loving
Mhm.
kindness and forgiveness to relationship with mom and others,
Mhm.
to relationship with daughter and others. If we can teach our daughters to really trust their inner wisdom
Yeah.
and that inner sense of self, if we do that work and model that for our daughters, and they learn to trust that inner wisdom and that inner compass, if you will, I mean, that's a huge step in the direction of a lifetime of much more healed and healing relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that can be the inner narrative for someone to carry throughout their lives. That will help them mother themselves throughout hard points, whether or not their mother, is alive for a long time or a little time or whatever. But yeah, teaching our
Yeah.
daughters that skill and that resilience and that level of connection and compassion and trust feels so important.
The other thing too is like the idea of smothering, right? Like that we like
Mm,
there's been so much information out there about parents and the way parenting has shifted and changed, and it does. I mean, generationally different parents have different like
yep.
sort of societal expectations. But sometimes the more that we want or desire something for someone, the more likely we are to sort of go overboard and push it.
Mhm.
And in that sense, I always think about the more compelled I feel to do the thing, to push, to whatever, perhaps that's the invitation to then step back, before I live into that impulse. What
Mhm.
would it be for me to just pause for a minute and check in with what is this really about? Like, and
Mhm.
is this the only tool, the only means I have to articulate what it is I'm feeling or thinking in this situation? Or is
Mhm.
there perhaps a different approach that I could take that might be heard better?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so funny because as you're saying that, I'm thinking about my daughter. She just turned 2, and lately she's been, like,
Mhm.
running into the room and doing these spins and saying, "I'm so beautiful. I'm so beautiful." And she's just, like, spinning and, like, in her element. And I'll say, like, "Yeah, you're beautiful and you're smart and you're funny and you're kind and you're a good sister." And I'm like, I could, like, go for an hour of, like, all of these other words to describe her. And I'm like, "It's okay, Sarah. Just, like, chill a little bit. Like, she can run into the room and do a spin and say she's beautiful, like, move on with her day." So it's like, yes, and you're so much more. And that feels so important for her to know and learn and internalize throughout her life. And sometimes it's that like overcompensation of like, no, there's so much more. But that's what kind of came to mind as you were just talking about that.
Yeah, I think that's like looking at it as this is a lifetime relationship, so I don't have to do it
Yeah.
all in this moment, right?
Right.
And I think I'm gonna mess up, like the self forgiveness part of it, right? I'm gonna mess up.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to make mistakes. And how can I forgive myself for those times when I've made mistakes? And then again, how do we come back to the repair and relationship?
Hmm.
So yeah, forgiveness has so many ways that it could take shape, and I think it really is dependent upon who is in the relationship and what the nature. This is such I mean, like, gosh, there are so many books out there about mother daughter relationships from
Hmm.
umpteen perspectives, that at the
Yes.
end of the day, we could read all the books in the world and it could still be a struggle for us to understand
Yeah.
and to lean into what we want. And so, again, that's where I say, if you're really in a struggle, who are the other wise voices you can turn to in your life
Hmm.
that might offer some objective space? And I remember my great grandmother. So, my mother was really struggling with my middle brother. He was very obstinate and just completely was not willing to listen, was not willing to work with her. And my mom kept trying to, like, in situations like, force it. And the more that he would respond with resistance, the more that she would go in after him. Like, no, you
Hmm.
have to do this. No, you have to change. And he was small at this time. And I remember my great grandmother just sitting in her rocking chair and very like Zen like. I mean, this woman had 9 children too. But very Zen like, just being like, Lucy, just let him be. He will figure it out. Give him some space.
Hmm.
Give him some space. And my mother finally sort of let go and allowed that. And it was like night and day. Within an
Yeah.
hour, my brother, less than an hour, my brother completely just shifted and went and did the thing that my mother was trying to get him to do without having to ask him.
Mm.
Sometimes less is more.
Yeah.
And our mothers or our mother figures in our lives, our grandmothers, our great grandmothers, they might all play a role in that. And it doesn't mean that we have to be like them, but to honor that just because this one aspect of their life I don't really agree with, or these few aspects of their life, doesn't mean that mom, grandmom, aunt, whomever doesn't have other things to offer.
Mm.
And the same with, my daughter. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I don't really agree with this decision that you're making, but let's talk about how can I support you as you're making it?
Yeah. Stepping outside of shame or blame or guilt or whatever else could
Mhm,
be into
mhm,
support and in relationship. Yeah.
mhm. And where does agency lie? Like,
Mhm.
where does your daughter start to develop her own agency and her own sense of self? And where are you perhaps hindering that? We want what's best for our children. We
Mhm.
love them to sometimes to the point though of um it being so much intense love and shown in such a way that it actually winds up creating more harm than good. So, yeah, that spaciousness for the individuality of each person and to honor and celebrate that, mothers and
Mm.
daughters alike. I'm much more today. I never wanted to be like my mom. I will say this. I hated her. I remember I was almost ready to go to college. It was like probably 2 weeks before I was ready to go off to my freshman year of college. And I just remember at one point screaming at her and being like, "I cannot wait till I'm not here anymore." Right. I don't even remember what the context of the fight was. And then like throughout my life, because my mother had her own issues with body shame, her own issues with mental health, her own issues with boundaries. She probably was a borderline personality. So it was a tough push pull. And yet now having done the work, my internal work of healing, and also then expanding that to my relationship with her, even with her being gone, now I
Mm.
see my mother and myself and I celebrate it. I'm like, "Oh, wow, this
Mm.
is like the really awesome part of my mom that I miss, but that I can still
Mhm.
experience by virtue of living as her daughter in this world," right? Like I used to
Yeah.
hyper focus on all the terrible things about her, right? And that was part of
Mhm.
my healing journey. I used to
Yeah.
blame her immensely. And now I find myself really like longing for those aspects of her that were so good, and that as much as I might carry the wounds of suffering that her own suffering passed on to me, that I can do the work of healing around them myself with a trusted others, but that also I can celebrate who my mother was.
Mm.
And I think about my mom. There's one thing that she used to say to me. So Billy Joel has this song, Lullaby,
Mm.
and the line from it is, "One day your child may cry, and if you sing this lullaby, then in my heart, or then in your heart, I will always be a part of you."
Mm.
And I remember my mother saying that to me, and like, she's crying, and I'm like, "Oh my God, just whatever." Like, I was probably a
I
teenager.
roll. Wait, it's called side eye now. Side eye.
Side eye, yeah. And yet now I remember that, and that had to probably be 30 years ago, she probably said that to
Mm.
me. But now I think about that and I think, yeah, she's there she is, she's in my heart, she's in me, and I can celebrate that and love that. And as much as I wish she were here, I'm getting married, right? Like I am married
Mhm.
technically, in the eyes of the law, but I'm having a wedding next year. And my mom won't be there, and there'll be a sense of grief and loss in her not being a part of this process. There is a sense of
Mhm.
grief and loss. At the same time, there's also a sense of gratitude for what I carry with me that she helped me to come to know, both
Mhm.
in what she was able to offer and in what she wasn't able to offer, but which, the space that her death brought, sort of invited me into. And that's a weird way to talk about gratitude. I wouldn't,
Mhm.
if I could have my mother back, I would have my mother back. At the
Mhm.
same time, I wouldn't want my mother to have to suffer the way that she did, right? Like she suffered, and I'm able to see that and have
Mhm.
compassion for that now. And in
Yeah.
developing that compassion over time, I was able to find forgiveness and healing and,
Mhm.
to accept she did the best that she could. She grew up in a very abusive household. She was adopted by a mother who was horribly emotionally abusive and neglectful, and her father was an alcoholic and, just horribly physically abusive and sexually abused her. Like,
Mm.
my God, the fact that she was able to be as amazing as she was is a
Yeah.
testament to who she was,
Yeah.
right? She
Yeah.
was pretty amazing.
Absolutely.
Um, and I carry that resilience and that survival in me, and I thank her
Mm.
for that.
Yeah. Mm. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What kind of resources do you feel like you have for folks who are struggling in their relationship with mothers with their mother, with their daughter, the mother-daughter relationship in general.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that there's so much out there, right?
And there's
Like
so much out there. Yeah.
there, yeah. So maybe we start closer to home, right? So
Mm.
like maybe we start with the wise women who are in our lives and start with them and who are safe to talk to. Um, and maybe we start with, you know, having conversations with them in a way that helps us to sort of sort through all the emotions. And that wise woman might be have to be a therapist, right? Like it might be a
Mhm.
therapist, but to not put all of the onus on mom or daughter to have to be the agent of change. Um, so I think that's part and parcel of it. Doing our own work, as I said, in our own journey of self discovery and self healing. And, you know, there's plenty of, if we think about body and food, I mean, there are a lot of wonderful resources on the Reclaim
Mhm.
Nutrition website, you know, about
Mhm.
parenting kids around developing healthy sense of relationship with body and food. I certainly would invite people to check that out. You know, are there other opportunities for mothers and daughters to connect through maybe your faith community? Or through some sort of community group for support or healing, where there are others you can sit with, whether
Mhm.
you are together or separate, and sort of talk about the struggles that you're having safely and, you know, with folks who can offer you compassion that maybe in that moment mom or daughter can't.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that, you know, and if you go on Amazon or whatever local bookstore you'd like to go to and support,
Yeah, it'd be good. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you can come up with, you know, you put in a search for mothers and daughters and it's like umpteen million results and there are, you know, umpteen million perspectives. And so
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing is like, how do we learn to trust ourselves and really tailor it? So I can go and avail myself of all of this dialogue that's out there. But at the end of the day, that is not the authority on this relationship.
Mm.
So how do I sort through that? And again, that's where I think a therapist, a
Mm.
trusted elder, if you will, might be
Mhm.
helpful.
Yeah.
Dads or the other mom in the
Dads.
family, right? Like
Mhm.
some of us have
Mhm.
two moms. Some of us have a stepmom we're close to. Our fathers, my
Mhm.
father was a huge peacemaker in our family. And so like to not discount the role of other family members as well. My brothers became a real source of support and validation for me because they understood what it was like to live in our household. And yes,
Yeah.
they were sons to my mother, not a daughter to her, but there was still this validation that like I wasn't alone and others got it and understood. So whether that's
Mm.
through siblings or through a support group, the idea of not feeling alone in that process I think is really important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Awesome. Awesome. So complicated, so nuanced relationships with mothers and daughters, and healing is going to look so different for literally everyone. And you're so right of trusting what feels right for you in terms of your relationship and your healing and yeah, being with yourself through it all. So thank you so much
Yeah,
for sharing your experiences about your relationship with your mom and for giving us the insight that you gave us. So appreciate it.
of course, of course. Happy to be here and sit with everyone, and I encourage continued dialogue. You know,
Mhm.
this isn't there's no one way for any of us. So, you know, I just hope that maybe I'm getting sentimental here, but like, you know, if we have our mothers in our lives, you know, where are we being invited to further healing and forgiveness? If we have our daughters still in our lives, where are we being invited to the same?
Mhm.
That there still is possibility, even if we've given up all hope. Perhaps there's a new
Mhm.
path we have yet to traverse that might take us
Yeah.
toward what we had hoped for. And at the same time, we can grieve that which we will never have.
Yeah. Mm. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, everybody, we'll be back next week with another episode. Next week, we're talking with Emily about body dysmorphia. So we'll talk to you then.